All right, please try to find a seat. It's 11, so we'll start with the WaterTalk. Welcome everyone to the WaterTalk, organized by the Water Institute. My name is Roy Brouwer, Executive Director of the Water Institute. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that we participate today on traditional territories of the Neutro, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and we're situated here on the Haldeman Tract, land granted to the Six Nations, and I think I'm supposed to click now. Land that was granted to the Six Nations in the 1800s. That includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River, as depicted here on the map. And in the Water Institute, like elsewhere in the university, we aim to contribute to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action through research, learning, teaching, and community building in collaboration with the university's Indigenous Initiatives Office. So I'm very happy to move on to introduce the speaker of today, Dr. Jackie MacDonald Gibson. She's the head of the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. And this is her introductory slide. Her research develops quantitative methods to characterize environmental risks to human health and to identify optimal technical and policy solutions. Her research has characterized and sought solutions to eliminate inequities, and she will talk about that today, in access to safe, reliable drinking water services in North Carolina and elsewhere. Dr. Gibson earned a dual PhD from the Department of Engineering and Public Policy and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. She has a master's degree from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a BA in mathematics from Bryn Mawr College. She's currently also a topic editor for environmental science and technology, and she has an enormous network. I saw online she worked, among others, I believe, with Bruce Rittman, who's, I think, at ASU. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce and welcome Dr. Jackie Gibson to the floor. Please welcome her.
It's a really long way away from home, but it was only an hour and 40 minutes in the air to fly directly from Raleigh, North Carolina to Toronto, so it's really not that far away. And we have so much in common, of course. So who in the room, are there any undergraduate students in the room? Graduate students, who's a graduate student? Excellent, so lots of grad students and everybody else, faculty and staff, I assume. Great, well, it helps to know who I'm talking to, so yeah, thanks for coming. Oops, wrong way. Oh, okay, yeah, okay. So I'm gonna really talk about work that I've done looking at access to safe, reliable drinking water in the state of North Carolina, where I live. I should have put that on a map, but like I said, you can fly there in an hour and 40 minutes, just due south from here. North Carolina's been in the news lately because of Hurricane Helene, which caused a lot of devastation in the western part of the state, which is mountainous. I live in the central and eastern part of the state, which is flat, and we just got a lot of rain, so we were okay. But anyway, I got really interested in water infrastructure when I was a teenager, and at age 16 had a wonderful opportunity to go and visit my aunt, who was working in the Peace Corps in Lesotho. Has anybody here ever been to Lesotho? Oh my goodness, excellent, okay. Yeah, so did 2 people raise their hand or just Roy? Okay. Well, Lesotho is this little tiny landlocked country in the middle of South Africa. It's basically where native people fled there when English and Dutch settlers came in, and it's landlocked and very mountainous. So the native peoples that were living there could flee up into the mountains. The land was not very easy to farm. It was easy for people to defend themselves. So that's where Lesotho is. This was in 1980, so a long time ago. I was 16 years old. My aunt was living there for 2 years, and I went to visit her. And I had, till that point, lived a sheltered kind of lower middle class life in the US, and just did not realize the kinds of conditions that other people lived in. So this is my aunt right here, and that's me, and that's my younger brother, and this is her home, her rendezvous, in a small village in Lesotho. And I came to realize there that where there was no running water, and people spent a lot of effort to haul water, and you had to be very careful with every drop that you used, that it was a great luxury to live in a place where I could just turn on a tap and get water whenever I needed and count on it being safe to drink, and also have a toilet to flush. So anyway, it was a very eye-opening experience. I think many people in the US who work on water supply issues may have had similar experiences, just going to places and realizing not everybody gets the benefit. So where I grew up is actually on the other side of the United States from where I live now. I grew up in Palo Alto, California, which is right down in this area, right here, south of San Francisco. Here's the San Francisco Bay, the Pacific Ocean. And I just, again, in Palo Alto, I just took it for granted that I could turn my tap and there was as much water as I needed. I could take a shower. We had droughts occasionally and took shorter showers and didn't water our yards, but you know, the water was great, and it was delicious, safe water piped all the way from the mountains of California, from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. And you can see what a tremendous civil engineering project this was in the early part of the 20th century to bring this water all the way from the mountains to the Bay Area. Here's a picture of the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. That's the source of the drinking water where I grew up in Palo Alto. And again, it's way up in the mountains. That's about a 4-hour drive up into the Sierra Nevada. So huge infrastructure project that I had absolutely no appreciation for. And then, of course, I eventually went to school, found my way into civil and environmental engineering because I was interested in issues of water, and that's where I learned how important clean drinking water is to human health. This is just a chart that some of you may have seen before that shows some of the great public health achievements of the 20th century on a timeline. So who here is a student in a public health field? Anybody? Oh, okay, so we've got some folks from public health. So on this chart, you'll see this is the rate of the crude death rate for infectious diseases. And this is the US from 1900 to 2000. Here's the first continuous use of chlorine in water. And so, of course, what does chlorine do? It kills pathogens that might be spread through drinking water. There's the influenza pandemic. Here's penicillin. But anyway, you can see where do things start to drop apart from the influenza pandemic. It's really with water treatment, and then there were these other interventions, antibiotics, vaccinations, and so on. But again, this was really part of a package of tremendous achievements in public health that greatly reduced deaths from infectious diseases. This is just similar information. This is for different cities in Baltimore, and this is a paper that was written by a couple of economists. Sorry, the date's wrong. It should say 2005, called The Role of Public Health Improvements in Health Advances, the 20th Century United States. And it looked at what happened with infectious disease rates in major US cities over time as these cities introduced water treatment systems. So here is Baltimore, Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Jersey City, and you can see cities began to introduce chlorination, and infectious disease rates began to drop, and then they put in filters and things improved even more. So some cities did it the other way, filtration first and then chlorination. So anyway, these researchers credited a very large percentage of the decrease in premature mortality from infectious diseases and in child mortality to the advent of community water systems and water treatment. And of course that includes wastewater treatment so that you're not basically flushing raw sewage into your source of drinking water. But then what I discovered just kind of went along in life, and I assumed until very late in life that we really had things pretty well under control in the US. I mean, after all, if I could grow up drinking water that was piped hundreds and hundreds of miles from the mountains to the Bay Area, you know, things must be good. And I moved to North Carolina in 2007, and again, that's in the southern part of the United States on the East Coast. And I began to find out that not everybody had the advantage of community water service, even if they were in an area where it would geographically make a lot more sense, for example, than Palo Alto piping all its water from the mountains. So this is just a map of one of the communities, and I'm going to tell their story more in detail, but I just wanted to introduce it at the beginning so you can understand some of the geography of the communities where I've been working. So there's a color scheme here, and the color scheme is the demographics. So demographics are in terms of proportion African American, and the white is 0 to 25%. This dark orange is 75 to 100%. And you'll see, so this is a historically African American neighborhood. These red lines are the boundaries of the neighboring town. It's called Apex, and you see this boundary, strange boundary pattern of the town where it kind of surrounds this historically African American neighborhood but doesn't include it. And because it's not included, it doesn't get access to these lines. These lines are the water lines that deliver treated drinking water to the residents of Apex. And the water line stops right here. And all of these little rectangles are residential parcels. So these are people's properties, individual homes. And everybody here has to supply their own water and handle their own wastewater because they also don't have connection to the community wastewater system. And this is just an example of kind of an organizer for the community that I got to know and began to work with a number of years ago. Standing right here, there's a fire hydrant, and that fire hydrant is right there. And he told me that because this fire hydrant is a dead end on the city's water line, the city would periodically open the hydrant to flush and clean out the water system. And this is downhill in this direction, so clean water would go rushing through this neighborhood. But meanwhile, these homes weren't connected. And it turned out that many residents were facing problems with their water. I went in initially thinking it was going to be quality problems. It turned out it was much more than that. Some homes, their wells did not yield enough water to even run like a washing machine or take a shower at home. One house had no flow from its well. It had just completely dried up. So no running water, and they were actually hauling water. So that's just a bit of the geography to motivate it. How I found out about these communities is I just happened to be lucky enough to get introduced to the new Director of Public Health for the state of North Carolina, Jeff Engel. He was newly appointed in his position. This was 2009, and through a mutual contact, we ended up having lunch together, and I said, well, you're the newly appointed health director. You know, this is such a great opportunity. What are the things that you're most interested in working on as health director? And he told me one of his top priorities was addressing equity and access to drinking water services. And I thought, what? What are you talking about? You know, it's North Carolina, it's the United States. Here we are, the year 2009. And he told me that he was hearing anecdotal stories of communities that didn't have access to reliable or safe water, but he had surveyed counties across the state. So in the United States, our states are divided into counties. In North Carolina, we have 100 counties. Every county has its own health director. So Dr. Engel sent a survey to all of these county health directors and said, tell me what kinds of problems people in your county are having with access to safe and reliable drinking water. Only about a third of them responded, and nobody had anything quantitative. There were just anecdotal tales. And so with his encouragement, I began looking at, can we figure out how big is this problem? At this point, I had not met the folks in the community that I just showed you. Where are these problems occurring? How big of a problem is it? How big of a public health problem is it? So that's the, what's the quality of the water that people do have access to in these communities? and how are these gaps affecting their health, and then what can we do about it? So just this one lunch conversation with a policymaker launched research that really I've been working on for a very long time now, and it turned out even just answering the where was a whole lot more complicated than I thought. And I still don't have a complete answer for reasons that I'll explain. So I'll start with the where. And what I began researching this after talking to Dr. Engel, some of the kinds of communities that were having problems, like the one I showed you, I began to read anecdotal stories about these communities. And where these communities were located is on the borders of cities and towns. So areas where it should be really easy to just run a water line because there's already one for a city, right? A lot closer than the mountains to Palo Alto, for example. So this is a map of North Carolina. All of these spatial units here are the counties. All of these colored areas are areas that are on the borders of cities. So the city or town is the white in the middle. And these are areas that have not been incorporated into the city. By North Carolina law, cities can claim complete authority over land use decision-making in areas up to 3 miles from their boundary. So what is that, about 5 kilometers? Sorry for my English units. Without having to provide municipal services or voting rights in the town elections. So these are areas, all of these colored areas are areas where cities, the city in the middle gets to decide what land uses are going to be allowable, but they don't have to provide any services. And the stories I was finding is that there were, the community I showed you at the beginning is in one of these areas. So here is Wake County, and this community was in one of these little colored areas there next to the city of Apex, which is next to Raleigh, where I live, which is the capital of the state. It's, yeah. So I began looking in these areas to see, could I figure out in these areas that were so close to municipal services, how many people there were without water? I should add that although cities are not required to provide services like water and wastewater to these areas, they can decide to do so if they wish, but they're not required to by law. So everybody who's within the city gets access to city services. If you're not in the boundaries, that those services aren't guaranteed. So that's kind of summarizing. These areas can extend up to 3 miles beyond city limits. The property owners don't have any say in whether they're included in these what are called extraterritorial jurisdictions, or ETJs. They can't vote in municipal elections, and they don't have guaranteed access to city services. And I began, again, doing some research and trying to find out what other people had done in this area. And again, this was 2009, so at the time this was a much more current paper, but I found this work by a sociologist who looked at this issue, and why, what he found is that there were sort of racial inequities in the drawing of municipal boundaries in the American South. And why was that? Because there was concern that if you were to incorporate all of these surrounding areas, then the sort of white power base in the town would be broken up. And this is a legacy definitely of the pre-Civil War area, and then post-Civil War Reconstruction, an effort for white towns and cities to try to maintain their political power. So it's a legacy that has had a very long reach. And what I began to try to figure out, well, how many people living in these kinds of areas don't have access to water or sewer service? And I should add, not all of these areas are majority African American areas. Some wealthier people like to move out into these areas beyond the boundaries and build a big estate and everything like that. I'm not so worried about them because they're better resourced to provide for their water and wastewater needs on larger properties usually. But anyway, I began trying to figure out, well, could I map this across the state? And it's, as you can see from what I showed you, this occurs at a pretty small spatial scale. That community was pretty small, so I need data at a pretty small spatial scale, ideally at the household. And what I found out is that in 1990 was the last time in the United States the government asked people where they were getting their household water and how they were handling their household wastewater. So these are two questions. Every 10 years in the United States, we have a population census. Everybody is supposed to respond, every household. And these were two questions in 1990. Do you get your water from a public system, such as a city water department or private company, an individual drilled well? There's still people with dug wells, which are shallower and less safe, or some other source, such as a spring, creek, river, cistern. And then this question was, is your building connected to a public sewer? Yes, connected to a public sewer. No, connected to septic tank or cesspool. No, use other means. Well, after 1990, there was a big effort in the US to kind of shrink government, and under President Ronald Reagan, and so these questions were eliminated. But what I began to do is do some research and see, what are other ways to get this information. And I found out that just a very small number of the 100 counties in the state, so here's the state of North Carolina again, mountains where the hurricane hit, coast, Raleigh's right in here, Wake County is where I live now, about 1 million people in the county, and they have property tax records for every single parcel of land in the county that happen to say, to contain information about whether that parcel is hooked up to a community water system or a community sewer system. And this is just to give you an idea of the demographics of this county. These data are a little bit old, so this is probably higher now, but it's the wealthiest county in the state. And that's, again, the picture that I showed you from the beginning was right here in the middle of the county. So very wealthy county. So the first thing, with a group of students, basically we began to compile information from these tax records and then link that to information from the census, US Census, about the racial composition of neighborhoods where these houses were located, and also overlay that with maps of where the boundaries of the cities and towns were. So there's a lot of color going on, so I'll explain what this means, but this is what we were doing to try to sort out where these communities might exist. So everywhere in gray is just a rural area, or else it's water. So these are not cities or towns, and they're also not in those extraterritorial jurisdictions that I talked about. Everywhere in yellow is a city or town with boundaries shown, some crazy city boundaries. You can see some kind of holes in the middle. And in these yellow areas, everybody's got community water and sewer service. Everywhere that's not yellow or gray is one of these extraterritorial jurisdictions. That is, the city that is neighboring it has decided that they're going to claim land use and zoning authority over that area. And in light blue, these extraterritorial jurisdictions, there is community water service available. So like I said, cities and towns may elect to extend water service, or in some cases, these are developments, and the developer will have put in a small water system, but it's regulated. Everywhere that's salmon or red is one of these extraterritorial jurisdictions without water service, and you can see what a strange map it is. Like, you'll have these little red communities, which is a majority African-American community. It's right next to a city, and also extraterritorial jurisdictions where folks have water service and they have to self-supply their own water. So it's a very strange spatial pattern. So we began to map that out. Who here has had a class in regression where you've learned about regression models? Statistical regression, okay. Not everybody, so I'll not assume that everybody, but what we do with regression models is we take a big data set and we see what patterns can we observe in it. In this case, my big data set was all the rows were a house in Wake County, and the columns were what's the demographic composition, so what's the percentage of African American in the little neighborhood surrounding that house, and do they have a connection to a municipal water supply, yes or no? And also, what's the income of the little neighborhood there, the median household income? And so what we wanted to do is see, well, if there's an effect of race, then if we're trying to predict whether that house has a connection to a city water supply. We want to know, does race help explain whether that connection exists? So looking at percent African American. We also want to control for income to see, is this just a phenomenon of differences in income, or is there something about race going on? And so we look at our data set and we find the coefficients that best predict the chances of water service. I looked also at other things that might predict this, by the way. These aren't the only things, but this was kind of the final model, and that's kind of a crude plot of our data, kind of grouped into categories. But basically what it said is, our model said that the chances of having water service at someone's house in one of these extraterritorial jurisdictions, not in the cities, but specifically in those extraterritorial jurisdictions, decrease, so that's what the negative sign is, by 3.8% as the percentage of African Americans in that neighborhood increased by 10%. So, and this was highly statistically significant, and it also held even if we account for income. So we would expect that in wealthier areas, people are more likely to have water service, and that shows up too. So that was interesting. I didn't necessarily think that that's what was going to show so clearly in this data set. And then I began to talk to people about this, like in the county health department, and actually it was really strange because some folks in the environmental health services department in the county said, well, what's wrong with private wells? You know, their water is perfectly clean. I grew up on a private well out in the country, or my grandma's farm has a private well, because these homes were supplying their water through allegedly private wells, although as I found out later, not everybody's wells were working. So I began to first look at water quality, not thinking that people would have wells that weren't even working. I started to think, well, is it really true? I mean, a great advantage, as you saw in the data from the beginning, is when you have connection to a community water system, there are professional engineers that are designing treatment processes to remove the pathogens that might cause people to get infectious diseases, and also remove chemical contaminants, and treat the water so that things like lead and other metals aren't released from the plumbing through corrosion control. But if you're just on your own in your household and you're pumping up water from a well in your backyard, you don't have access to those professional services. So does it really make a difference? And so we began recruiting homes from these areas. This is Wake County again. It's the same map, but just a slightly different color scheme. So everywhere in dark blue is within a city boundary. The light blue areas are extraterritorial jurisdictions where there is community water service, and the yellow areas are there's none. So we went around and recruited homes. You can see here is this yellow area is, again, one of these neighborhoods that doesn't have community water service, surrounded by water everywhere. This is not the one I showed you in the beginning. These are some other ones. And we collected water samples. At this time, I didn't have very much money. I was running with a small, pilot research grant from my university, so we could only collect a limited number of samples. This is one of my students at the time, Frank, with one of our participants, and this is her wellhead, and there's her house in one of these little yellow neighborhoods. Again, running with very little money at the time, we had enough to scrounge up enough to test 57 houses for indicators of contamination with microorganisms, which again is an indicator that there may be contamination of the water with human or animal fecal matter that could transmit infectious diseases. And we just tested for 3 kinds of organisms. Do you have any environmental health microbiologists in the room? Some of you know what these are. What are indicator organisms?
They're like an organism that is easier to detect than maybe the target organism that you're looking for, but can indicate that there might be like a problem in the system that's allowing the more dangerous organism in.
Exactly. So they're an indicator of the potential that there might have been some human waste or animal waste getting into this water. And we tested for these 3 different indicator organisms. These ones are more specific than total coliforms. These are more specific to warm-blooded animals. Here's some undergrad students who are volunteering, working with me in the laboratory at the time of Dr. Mark Sobsey. Some of you may come across his work. And then here's Frank learning how to use an ICP-MS instrument to analyze samples for lead. We had very little money at the time, again, so we could afford to test 29 houses for lead. And this is what we found. And we also got data from the community water systems in the area to figure out the prevalence of microbiological contaminants in the community water services provided in the surrounding areas. So again, we look for these 3 different indicator organisms. The blue bars are the percentage of households that we looked at that had detections, tested positive for these. The red are the fraction of samples that the city collects and tests regularly that test positive. And I mean, the short message is that 2/3 of the houses were positive for at least one of these, and a fair number were positive for these ones that tend to be much more specific of contamination with fecal waste. So that was really concerning. And then you can see again, sorry, going back, you know, the benefits of having a professionally managed water supply is that your water is filtered and disinfected. A lot of harmful microorganisms attached to solid matter in the water, and so a lot of them are filtered out, and what's not filtered out is most of it gets removed with disinfectant. And that's why you saw those infectious disease trends really drop in the first part of the 20th century. But these folks who are just getting water from their backyard don't know that they need to be testing their water for microbial contaminants. So for lead, this is a histogram of the results for our lead testing. In the United States, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency says that if a regulated water system, so community system run by professional engineers, finds lead at concentrations of more than 15 parts per billion, so here's 15 parts per billion, out in the service areas, because they test a certain number of homes in the area they serve for lead, and if they find lead more than 15 parts per billion in at least 10% of homes, they have to take action. Anybody know where lead tends to come from in drinking water? Is it coming from the ground or pipes? That's right. Anybody know what water utilities do to prevent lead from releasing out of the pipes?
Phosphate corrosion.
Yes, phosphates or other corrosion control methods. So they typically will mix in something like phosphates that are harmless and form a nice scale, precipitate and form a nice scale on the pipe and prevent the lead from dissolving. But folks with private wells, their water might be corrosive and they might not even know it. And so that's where the lead is coming from, the pipes. And in the case of if you're relying on a well in your backyard, the well has metal components that also might release lead. And so we found a substantial number of our homes had lead at the time. Who's heard of the Flint water crisis? Okay, that made big news in the United States, Flint, Michigan. What happened there is Flint is a majority African-American city that went bankrupt. A new city manager came in and had the wonderful idea of saving money by, instead of buying nice water from the city of Detroit that was well treated, to reopen a very old water treatment system that brought its water in from the Flint River and did not have adequate corrosion control. So when that water was switched over, a whole lot of lead got released into the system because the corrosion wasn't controlled. So all of this lead that had been stored in the pipes over all these years just washed out into the system. And then the people that were monitoring water throughout the system, basically there was some fudging of data. So it was known early on that there was a problem, but the data were hidden. So there were all kinds of lawsuits. So anyway, that was, I consider, a relatively rare event, right? In Wake County, this is the wealthiest county in North Carolina. Our water systems are, you know, very well equipped to handle corrosion. Anyway, but what's relevant about Flint is that in Flint, about 30% of the homes that were tested had lead above 15 parts per billion, and here we saw 28%. So it was like a similar prevalence, and that was making national news. And so then I began thinking about, well, this is bad. We know microorganisms put people at risk. Pathogens, there's many good microorganisms, but pathogens put people at risk for infectious diseases. Do we see a signal there? Are these people in these areas experiencing a higher rate of any infectious diseases? Those of you who work overseas in the developing world may know a key indicator is acute gastrointestinal illness, which tends to be associated with contamination of drinking water with human or animal waste. So that's what we looked at, and we also looked at lead. Are we seeing any signal that children in the kinds of communities that I was looking at had elevated levels of lead in their blood? And if so, what were the impacts on the children? And so to do this work took getting to be friends with staff that keep public health records in the state. And we were able to get records of emergency department visits for acute gastrointestinal illness. So these are cases of gastrointestinal distress that are bad enough that somebody's willing to go to an emergency room or compelled to go to an emergency room. And I did open this to look at data for the entire state of North Carolina, just looking at private wells in general. So this wasn't specific to extraterritorial jurisdictions. And so I linked that, my students linked that with records of private well testing for bacterial contaminants. And this was, and then for looking at lead, we were able to actually just focus on the one county that I showed you on the map before, because after a lot of effort, we were able to get blood lead test results for about 60,000 children living in that county over a 20-year period, and to get the addresses of those children. And then we could match their address with where they would get their drinking water, and seeing if those that had community water service had lower lead levels than those that did not have community water service. So answer to that question, more regression modeling. What we're trying to predict here, this is basically the number of cases of acute gastrointestinal illness in a county in a given month. And we want to predict it from monitoring data for the regulated community water systems that serve that county. So that's these. What's observed about bacteria in those systems. And then what's observed in private wells that have been tested. Some people with private wells may elect to get their well tested, and was able to get state data on that. Most people don't, but anyway. And then we look at, it's called a population intervention model approach. Any epidemiologists in the room? Okay, well, this is an epidemiologic approach where you look at, okay, so you look at your data set. You have a big data set. We have counties, months, emergency department visits for acute gastrointestinal illness in each county. We know something about the quality of the water delivered in those counties from the regulated systems and the backyard wells that people have. And then we want to look at, well, what if we took all of these people that were on private wells, so these are people on private wells, and we move them all so they're getting treated water from a municipally regulated system or community system. And I guess I'm going to show you the rest of the methods before I get to the answer on that. For the lead, our method was different. Again, we got children's blood lead surveillance data for all of the Wake County over a 20-year period. And then we matched that information with a whole lot of other data. I don't need to go into it, but property tax records, census information about demographics of the neighborhood, and we end up with this sample of these 60,000 kids. We know about their neighborhoods. We know about their house, what year it was built. We know where they're getting their drinking water. And so that was our sample. And then what we are trying to do there is say, can we predict, this is blood lead level, for a child I living in house J, based on their water source, their source of drinking water, and a whole bunch of other variables. And I'll skip ahead and just note that in our model of AGI, we found that acute gastrointestinal illness risks increase substantially with contamination of private well water. That's this 0.84. So your rate of emergency department visits in a given month in a county per population increases as you find more bacterial contamination in private wells. It also increases with bacterial contamination in the regulated water systems, that's these two, but not as much. The effect size is not as large. Okay, and I'll just skip on. And then this is the results for the private well, for blood lead. And again, this is focused on Wake County, where we have really fine scale data. Every child tested for lead in a 20-year period. We know where they're living. We know where they're getting their water. And from the statistical model, we get estimates of the effects of all these different variables on blood lead. And this chart is just basically showing the fractional change in blood lead as these different variables change. On this side, it means blood lead is higher for children that meet this characteristic. At the very top, compared to children with city water, those on private well water have higher blood lead. That's what that means. And then these are just other things that we know affect lead that we're controlling for the age of the child, year the house was built. What you notice here, what's happening here? Do blood lead levels, how are they affected by the age of the house? So this is the oldest houses. These are newer and newer and newer. Anybody? Going down for kids living in newer houses. Anybody know why that is?
Stop using lead solder.
Stop using lead paint and lead solder. But lead paint is really the big one, probably. Lead paint and lead solder. And then we control for some other things like income represented by home value. So the higher income, the lower the blood lead. All kinds of other things. But this really stood out that the kids in Wake County on private well water had higher blood lead. The other thing that was interesting is we also controlled for whether the kids are living in one of these extraterritorial jurisdictions where I was looking at water, and blood lead is higher there even if you control for these other things. So anyway, that's what we found. And then I have a brother who's a criminologist, and over a family dinner conversation, actually at the Christmas holidays, we got to talk, and I was telling him about my lead results, and he said, well, his specialty is preventing juvenile delinquency, and he said there's a lot of evidence that early life lead exposure has been associated with increased risks of juvenile delinquency. Wonder if there's anything going on there. So this led to another major data compilation effort, getting lots of difficult to obtain permissions from record-keeping agencies. And so to allow us to test the hypothesis that if you didn't have a public water supply, you were relying on a private well, not controlling the corrosivity of your water, lead dissolves in your household plumbing, gets in the blood. We knew that. We've seen these things already. Is there an effect on children down the road? And so what we did, my brother had a former student who worked in the data section of the Department of Public Safety, which basically houses all criminal records for the state of North Carolina. And through a lot of effort, we were able to get them to agree to take all the 60,000 children in our database of blood lead measurements and water sources and look through all their records to see if there were any reports for juvenile delinquency for any of those children. And we had blood lead data going back for 20 years, so we included kids who reached at least age 14 during that time period. So we know their lead exposure at age 1 or 2 when they were tested. Our data set then follows them and says, okay, who turned at least 14? And after they turn 14, is there a record of juvenile delinquency? And this is just a map kind of showing the locations of where these children were living that had complaints against them in our data set. The light blue dots are locations of children in our data set that had private wells. And I won't explain the details of this, but the goal is to see is lead exposure from private well water associated with water source, and does that extra exposure from the water translate to an increased risk that the child will be reported for some kind of delinquent act? And I was really surprised to see this also, but that indeed turned out to be true. So this is basically a plot of kind of the results of our analysis showing the big picture. This is the age of the child, ages 14 to 16. The solid lines are kids on private well water, and the dotted lines are kids on community water service. The black lines are race, so you've probably heard a lot of news. We have a lot of problems with inequities in our justice system in the US, and that really shows up here. These are white children, these are African American children. So we were able to get the races of these individual children. But in both sets, the risk of getting reported for a juvenile complaint is higher in the kids with private well water once they turn 14. So that was something that, it was a hypothesis. I really wasn't expecting that we were going to find it, and it turned out to be a very strong signal that withstood an incredibly rigorous peer review. So anyway, that's that. I'm going to go back to the Iron Gate community here, the one I talked about in the very beginning. And we wanted to know, okay, yeah. Well, like I said, I went in worried about water quality, and what I found is that folks living there didn't necessarily have running water. So they weren't even worried about water quality if they didn't have enough water to shower at home. This is just a picture of another gentleman I met in a different part of the state in an area very much like this. His well is all wrapped in blankets because when it freezes, if pipes break, he can't necessarily afford to fix it for a while, and then he's stuck hauling water. So just an illustration again of what that looks like. And what we found in surveys is that a lot of folks in this community that we were looking at had problems with water quantity. This is just the one community I showed you in the beginning, but 60% more than once a year their well failed for some reason. The only 20% had continuously reliable water coming out of their well. So that was a really big surprise. And what did were not able to do when they didn't have water? Obviously not flush their toilets, not take showers, not do laundry, all kinds of things we take for granted. So then I began thinking about, no, this is a terrible problem. What are we going to do? It seems so easy, right? Just run the municipal water line. But that maybe takes some time and some money in getting the cities on board. In the short term, can we at least try water filters and see if those help? Low-cost water filters. And then a longer term, extending municipal service. So a happy story out of this is that we were able to present the data we had collected to the town of Apex and convince them to incorporate this community into the town and extend water service. And this is a picture my collaborator in the community who I showed you at the beginning sent on the day that water pipes were being delivered to extend water into the neighborhood. So that was a good news. The filter work was led by my student Riley. That's him putting a filter in somebody's house. A lot of these low-cost filters, they're tested on treated water that's a very standardized quality, but private well water quality is variable, highly variable, so we really weren't sure if they'd work as well. So we looked at lead removal. Lots going on here, but Riley recruited homes, installed filters in these homes, tested their lead levels coming out of the water in the beginning, those are the red bars, and came back once a month. Pandemic hit, there was a gap, came back again. And the good news was that these filters were really consistently bringing lead levels way down. So this is the raw water, and this is the water flowing out of the filter. So water going into the filter, water going out. An interesting thing was that this was water flowing into the filter that hadn't yet come out of the kitchen faucet. And levels were higher when the water was coming out of the faucet. The faucet itself was a source of lead in a lot of these houses. I should say though, but the final green does reflect the lead coming out of the faucet. So enough was coming out to really bring these lead levels way down. But the problem is these filters, they were just granular activated carbon. They don't disinfect the water. So this is just some examples of Petri dishes and what happened. This is raw water going into the filter from one of the houses. Sample plated on this Petri dish. There's some organisms of some sort growing. This is the water coming out of the filter. And there's different kinds of organisms growing, and we did discover some opportunistic pathogens amongst those. So our kind of overall conclusion was that the water wasn't really worse off microbiologically, it was different, but that the filter wouldn't solve the microbiological contamination problems. So they need disinfection. Then the water went in the Iron Gate neighborhood, and a lot of people, professionals, said, well, it's not necessarily going to address their lead problems. There's probably going to be a big spike in the beginning. It's going to take a while to equilibrate. So I got a student involved, and she recruited households in the community to get their water tested before and after the pipes went in during the pandemic. This is her daughter helping prepare sample kits. And anyway, these are the households that participated. These were the starting levels of lead before the water went in. This is the date, so this would have been March 2024. And what you could see in each household was a big drop. These are the next sample dates here. Water went in about this time, and these are lead levels, and they really went down and stayed down. So that was good news. The corrosion control was really helping. So why is that this problem not solved? It's really money, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we've interviewed county managers and city water managers from other affected communities, and they just say, well, it's too expensive. We can't afford to connect these little areas to our town system. Even in the Iron Gate neighborhood, the individual residents had to come up with money. The city paid the money to run the water lines through the neighborhood. Actually, we were able to help them get a grant to do that, so that's where that money came from. But the homeowners still had a substantial amount to pay. They had to pay the city $1,800 just for the benefit of hooking up. We tried to negotiate that down, but that's what they had to pay. And then they had to hire a plumber to actually connect their home to this new water line that was run through the neighborhood. And like I said, we interviewed people, about why you're not doing this, and it's really a matter of money. Here's a quote from one mayor. We've got a section of town that wants to be annexed. The city won't do it. We did a study, and the payback was 115 years. So that's the battle. So anyway, the summary is, it's not necessarily the case that you can just count on having safe and reliable drinking water, even at this time in the modern nation of the United States. This has health effects on people. We can solve these problems, but there's money and policy barriers. And with that, I'll just say that I should have had a list of the dozens and dozens of students that have worked with me on this over the years. It's taken a long time to do all this. A lot of it really underfunded work and a lot of student volunteers. We have a lot of publications, so I can share this slide with you afterwards, but everything I showed today has been published somewhere. So, any questions?
Thank you very, very much. We got like 5 minutes for questions. Anyone who wants to kick off? If you have a question, please say who you are and then post the question.
Hi, my name is Rodrigo, or Rodrigo, if that's easier. And I had a lot of questions during the talk, but they were all answered by you.
Oh, okay, okay. Well,
The only one that I had left was, have you found any irregular connections to the water mains in these communities?
That's a great question. Is anybody illegally tapping in? I haven't found that. It's possible, but I have not found that. Yeah.
I work in Brazil, and that's one of the biggest
Oh,
issues.
yeah.
Water quality and also the water quality.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. That would be really interesting to find out. I think, our utilities tend to pretty well keep track of their water flow, and so something like that they would probably detect. Yeah.
We have another question here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doc. My name is Elisha. So I have two questions. The first one is whether GI pipes have the same effect as lead pipes in terms of lead pollution in water. And also, if you looked at fluorides in pollution in water, fluorides.
We did not look at fluorides. Fluoride is typically added to the water in community water systems for the dental health benefits. But it's also controlled, so water utilities need to keep it below a certain level. But I don't believe we have done some testing for fluoride, but haven't found anything at elevated levels. So it would more be the case that kids are getting less fluoride and then maybe experiencing more dental problems when they're older. We haven't looked at that, but that would be my hypothesis because their water's not fluoridated. But your first question was about what kind of pipe?
Okay, so back home we use GI pipes.
What are GI pipes?
They are galvanized pipes.
Oh, galvanized. Oh, galvanized. I know galvanized can be, and I'm not a corrosion chemist, but I know there's problems with galvanized pipes and lead release. Yeah. I believe galvanized contains a certain percentage of lead, and even it used to be the case in the US until just a few years ago that pipe material or fixtures could have 8% lead content by mass and be declared lead-free. But that's enough lead mass to cause problems. That law has changed, yeah.
Just give me a second, there's another one there.
Thanks very much, Dr. Jackie, for the wonderful presentation. I'm called Bernard Abundo. So I have one question about the microbial contaminants. So what are the measures taken by water treatment agencies to ensure that the indicators organisms, regardless of mutations and adaptations for their survival, mutations which occur within these organisms, are constantly eradicated? Do they also keep on changing the treatment process to make sure all the microbial contaminants are eradicated? And at what point do they realize that the microbial contaminants are almost beating the system?
Right. That's a really good question. And the approach is different for different utilities. The answer, do they change their treatment processes over time? Not generally, except for maybe like once a year, a system will switch its disinfectant to a more powerful disinfectant for a period of time just to kind of flush out the system. But in the US, we also have strong regulations on disinfection byproducts. So when you apply a disinfectant to kill organisms, as you may know, it can also interact with natural organic matter in the water and form things like chloroform and trihalomethanes. So those are regulated. So utilities really have to make that balance. But in my view, the overall impact of decreasing infectious disease risk is really important, and it's a trade-off that's been worth it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Noel. Thanks a lot for your nice presentation. I have a question about the legal status of the houses. So it means that they're not attached to any municipality. They don't pay taxes on. They're not. So I thought it was quite surprising that it's even possible that they're not like to the state they're not attached to, for example, the municipality next door. Or
Right. So the answer about taxes, they are part of the county, so they pay county taxes. They don't pay municipal taxes. And what I've been told by folks in city government, some people will say, well, these folks, they don't want to become part of the city because then they'll have to pay taxes. But actually, for these kinds of communities, they very much wanted to be part of the city and were willing to pay taxes to have the benefits of services. Like I said, there's almost like this two different categories of these areas. The one is the very wealthy who move into very large parcels, big homes that maybe don't want to be annexed because they just want to do their own thing. But I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about the kind that I showed you. Yeah.
Thank you. One very last question.
Hello. Hello, my name is Maricor. I have a question with regards to the relationship of lead exposure and juvenile delinquency.
Yes.
Were there any other factors in addition to just lead exposure, including mental health and some other factors that might, like socioeconomic factors that might be more of a would correlate more with juvenile delinquency, or is it just
It's not just the lead, but in our statistical models we control for many, many, many other factors. And that's actually published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and collaborated actually with an economist and criminologist on that. So that remaining effect is even when you control for those other things that we know might be important.
I thought that was really interesting.
And I just didn't show you the details, but you can see the paper.
Thank you all very much. There's an opportunity to talk to Dr. Jackie next door in the fishbowl. We'll serve some lunch over there. Let's give her another round of applause, please, for answering all your questions. Thank you for attending.